Good morning, everyone. I'm Dina Jensen, the Director of the Center for Nonprofit Leadership at California Lutheran University, and I'd love to extend a warm welcome to everyone signing on to this morning's webinar on adaptive leadership practices. We have a terrific virtual discussion planned for this morning with a few of our region's most respected nonprofit executive leaders. The past 9 weeks have demanded leadership from our sector and its leaders unlike any time before. And we're honored to create the space to share ideas, lessons, and explore the challenges and demands of our COVID-19 climate. A very special thanks to Geoff Green, who will serve as today's moderator, posing provocative questions and sharing his own insights to the discussion. We acknowledge up front that none of us has all the answers and at the moment, and that community, state, and global developments are fast-paced and change moment by moment. We've invited honest reflections from our colleagues on how each is managing and leading through this current time. Before we begin, I'd like to take a quick moment to express our sincere gratitude to today's sponsors, the Ventura County Community Foundation and Montecito Bank and Trust. Because of their generosity, these sessions are free to attend. We're grateful to Cal Lutheran and our own advisory board for making the commitment to our region's nonprofit sector as we navigate these demanding times. If you'd like to make a personal contribution to support and keep these webinars free of charge, I'll go ahead and put a link into the chat box and welcome gifts of any size. This session is also made possible through a collaborative partnership of capacity building partners across our region. The Center for Nonprofit Leadership is beyond grateful to the following partners: the Nonprofit Resource Network in Santa Barbara, the Ventura County Community Foundation, the Santa Barbara Foundation, the Fund for Santa Barbara, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Santa Barbara and Ventura Counties Chapter, Just Communities, Leading from Within, and Visionality, who's providing Zoom hosting services in support of today's learning community. A special thanks to Brianne and Emily from the Visionality team. This session will be recorded and made available after today's webinar, and we kindly invite you to use the Q&A feature to post questions throughout today's session. We'll be curating those questions, and Geoff will be feeding them to our panelists. If you experience any difficulties with the Zoom platform, not posing a question, but I'm having a problem hearing, seeing, navigating, you're welcome to use the chat function to communicate directly with the Visionality team. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to what I think is one of our region's master moderators, someone that we all emulate when we sit in the moderator chair, the one and only Geoff Green, the CEO of the Santa Barbara City College Foundation and a partner and friend and trusted ally to the nonprofit sector. So Geoff, I'm going to hand it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dina, and I'll extend my welcome to everyone as well. It's wonderful to see everyone here, or it's that C in finger quotes, of course, see everyone here. All bets are off through mediated technology, so I'll do my best to do what we would normally do in a real room together, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do this with you all. I really do look forward to our conversation this morning. I have to acknowledge that, of course, we're in one of the toughest moments of our history in the nonprofit sector and, of course, in our communities. But we're also in one of the most creative. So I think there's this tension that we're all living through where we have incredible opportunities that were really forced upon us, and how we respond to those and what our leadership does is key. So this morning, we've invited 3 outstanding leaders. These are friends and colleagues to many of us, people for whom we have great respect. They lead critical organizations. They do it in a regional way. They do it with a great sense of partnership and collegiality. And they have some big fights to fight from time to time. So the genesis of this conversation, the idea behind holding this webinar this morning in this fashion, was really to invite 3 folks who could reflect on what this moment means to them, to their organizations, and to talk about really what it means to lead a nonprofit organization through the multiple layers of the challenges that we're currently facing. We're, of course, facing near depression era unemployment. We're facing market volatility. We're facing some of our most already marginalized community members living on the edge, being forced even further down on the economic ladder. We are facing the tension within families who are forced to all stay at home and live together and run their school day and do all the things that people do. And so there's just a lot happening at once. And so the three folks that we have with us this morning, we've asked to get honest with us. And we want brutal honesty. In fact, just to show you the kind of brutal honesty, I'm going to quote one of our panelists in her Facebook posting about this morning's session when she was referring to the adaptive leadership practices title. She said, and I quote, "I suspect that adaptive leadership is our sector's jargon for, quote, figuring shit out on the fly." And that is truth. And that was Sigrid Wright. So thank you, Sigrid, for that reflection. I'm just going to out you right there. So to start with, I want to introduce our three panelists. We're going to give them each about 10 minutes to say a few words about their work and their experience. And then we will have a conversation for the remaining time. So to give some formal background for those who may or may not know, first I want to introduce Sigrid Wright. Sigrid is the CEO of Community Environmental Council. She's got a quarter century of experience in nonprofit environmental management in multiple organizations. Many of you know that Sigrid was with the organization for a number of years before she was named CEO. She is on a steering committee and a partner in many ways. She's on the Central Coast Climate Collaborative, the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation. You know that climate is one of her passions. She has been an author of many documents within the Community Environmental Council, and you may have seen her writing as of late, as well as her curation of key writings for us all to read and videos for us to watch if you're on the CEC list. She was an author of the Food Action Plan, the Santa Barbara County Regional Energy Blueprint. And for many, you know her as the architect behind the Santa Barbara Earth Day Festival. So for 15 years, she led the annual Earth Day production. And we'll talk about what that meant in this year's 50th anniversary that had to go virtual. So I am delighted to welcome Sigrid Wright to the conversation this morning. We also have with us Maricela Morales. Maricela has been with CAUSE, the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, one of the best acronyms I've ever come across. And she has been there since the beginning. She came on first as a volunteer, actually, with Living Wage Coalition in Ventura County, and then joined the team when there was a staff to join starting in 2001, which is in 01 when the CAUSE organization became an official 501c3 nonprofit. She's worked on a wide range of issues. You hear Maricela's voice on everything from economic justice, women's economic justice, a green economy, health coverage for all people. There's a lot of places where CAUSE's work is key and forefronted. She is a local native. She grew up in Ventura County, went to Fillmore schools, and went on from there. She was also elected, so she has not only done her work in the nonprofit sector, but was in Port Hueneme City Council as the first Latina elected to that council in 2002, and then went on to become the first Latina mayor in 2007. So we welcome you. Thank you so much, Maricela, for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Jenna Tosh. She is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Planned Parenthood of the Central Coast, which she has had in that seat since 2015. That is a tri-county chapter. She holds her doctorate in public affairs from the University of Central Florida, where she actually studied her very work that she now does in practice, which is reproductive health policies and their impact on teens in particular. She started her work with Planned Parenthood in 2005 in Orlando, Florida, where she ultimately did become the CEO before moving here to join our community. And I want to welcome you, Jenna, thank you for joining us this morning. So those are our three panelists. And at this point, I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to turn it over to Sigrid to give a few introductory remarks.
Wonderful. Well, I'm really glad to be here. And Geoff, I was just reflecting the last couple of weeks that that people who seem to really have an advantage right now are those who are comfortable with being bald. So I think you got it. You and Gary got it. And even better now for people who have big ears, because I'm finding those masks really aren't fitting. So we're in a new territory. I'm going to start just by talking about CEC and the impact on the organization, and then I look forward to the broader conversation a little later about how this may be affecting the environmental movement and the social sector in general. But so CEC is was started in 1970. We are turning 50 years old this year. Very solutions-oriented organization. For the last 15 years, we've been focused on climate solutions. Prior to that, we focused on things like recycling, hazardous waste reduction, environmental education, organic ag. We've been in a growth mode for about the last 4 years. We've seen about an 80% growth in our operating budget, so it's been pretty rapid growth mode. And in the last few years, we've really been transitioning to network-based work. So for the initial years that we were working on climate, we were kind of the only folks in the space, and now there are, mercifully, there's a lot of organizations, and that means that we are moving from kind of these individual or organization-based projects that we conceive of and implement into much more partnership and network-based. Our team is very energetic and fast-paced and comprised of system thinkers who are kind of paid to worry about the future. So we spend a lot of time talking and thinking about and advocating for basic human rights like clean air, clean water, healthy food, livable climate. So that is, that's just kind of the background on the organization. And then, like all of you, I feel like we took a sharp turn at a fast pace on a blind corner. And it felt for the first few weeks or months that everything kind of went into a slide and like we were just kind of hanging in midair. And initially, it actually even felt a bit like an identity crisis that because it was really impacting everything that defines CEC. So all of those words I just used before, productivity, social connectivity, the ability to work with partners, all of that really went into limbo. And many of our partners are nonprofit partners who were dealing with their own crisis. And then we also partner quite a bit with cities and counties of all 3 counties, Ventura, San Luis Obispo, and Santa Barbara. And those city and county staff were pulled into emergency management. On a personal level, I felt, I was really struggling that first month. We went from this rapid growth into this slight contraction. Plans that we'd been working on for years were put on hold. As I mentioned, it's our 50th anniversary. So this is a year we had been planning for many years. This was supposed to kind of be our moment. Climate change was finally on the public agenda. It wasn't just us, in a semi-crowded room. It really felt like people were there. Youth were bringing in that kind of vitality and moral authority. We were completing our 5-year strategic plan and about to launch a major fundraising campaign. And then on a personal level, this is also my 25th anniversary year. And so it really had felt like we and I were kind of made for this moment, and then we were all sent home. So I tend to kind of look for the meaning in things, and I do have some perspective on what all this could mean from an environmental or ecosystems standpoint, and which we can get into a little bit later. But I thought I'd talk first about the 5 key places where we have really felt this impact on an organizational level. The first place was on gatherings and events. We're a very event-driven organization. We average 2 to 3, sometimes 4 events a month. And we were feeling the impacts even before the official shelter in place, the couple of weeks prior when we started to hear about preparing for social distancing. And I had some immediate concern around that. Some of that concern is because from our climate resilience work, we know that social connectivity is really the #1 strategy for resilience. More than any other strategy, more than evacuation plans or alert systems, it's really that neighbor to neighbor connection and that mutual aid that really does build resilience. So I did have some concerns about that. On a kind of logistic level, we saw dozens of our own gatherings being canceled, from house parties to our leadership breakfasts. The biggest event that we had to deal with was Earth Day, and that was in mid-April, and that was also the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. We've also canceled our Green Gala, which is our primary fundraiser. But I do want to talk a little bit more later. The pivot we did on Earth Day under Kathy King's leadership and what we learned from that, because I think it was, first of all, it was very early in all of this, and I think it was instrumental. The second place where we really felt the impact, like everybody, was just in the work environment. again, our team's been growing over the past couple of years, so we've already had to address those work structures and flexible workspace and shared workspace with some teammates working at home. We were already in cloud-based systems, but I did still kind of have that typical employer's discomfort with large-scale remote work, and I've had to work through that and put some systems into place. But I did find early that it helped to fall back on a couple of key values of the organization. And that is that I think we built this culture of trust within the organization, and that we are a learning organization, that we're willing to experiment and share and reflect on what we're learning along the way. So we did take some logistical responses that included some very simple things like moving into Microsoft Teams. Presented a little bit of challenge because we do have some of our teams that work in another system. Right off the bat, I identified one staff member for tech support, which could be called at any time, day or night, for staff and board. And then we went quickly from bi-monthly staff meetings, so twice a month, to weekly staff meetings. I still was challenged by that in the first couple of weeks. Trying to read body language on tiny Zoom squares is really hard. And, you know, I hadn't realized, I knew that I relied on kind of emotional intelligence for management, but I hadn't realized how much of my day-to-day decision-making really is based on hundreds of little micro bits of information on body language and simple verbal cues. So we started employing in our staff meetings the Zoom breakout rooms right at the beginning of the staff meeting. We spend more time on just processing and social connectivity, longer check-ins. You know, everybody is processing something, whether it's worry or grief. I'd say about half of our staff have had other financial impacts to their households. So spouses or partners losing jobs or having wages cut. Everyone's dealing with concern about a family member or mental health. In my own family, we lost my husband's brother, most likely to COVID. So we had to make a lot of space in our staff meetings, and continue to do so to allow for everyone's kind of whole selves to show up. The third place where we felt this impact was just on financial unknowns. We started in a really financially healthy position with some good protocols. We have staff who are budget owners. We have strong board finance committee. We have clear financial reports. And we normally do a mid-year budget forecast, but it has required stopping and what I would say taking more like compass point readings more frequently. But because of those things, we haven't had to take, we didn't have to take drastic reactive measures, and we had focused the first couple of months just on getting a reading. We have taken a few measures, which included a hiring freeze on open positions. We've loaned one staff member to food bank to keep her employed because she was an events coordinator. We're most likely going to need to reduce a few benefits, and we've taken some other expense reductions. And on the income side, we had a diverse revenue streams, but really every single one of those has taken a hit: grants, contracts, philanthropy, our social enterprise, and we're actually even part owners of a local restaurant. So that's been a reduction as well. And so that payroll protection program was really essential. The fourth place where we felt that impact is really on internal and external communications. So internally, what I did is I started a weekly CEO report, and I think that's what you were referring to, Geoff. It started as a report just to my really inner circle, board and staff, and then that expanded out a bit and has morphed into really more reflections. We're doing more regular check-ins on our board and our allies, particularly our elderly members. We're offering to help them with their shopping. But the real impact has been externally on our external communications. We basically doubled the amount of newsletters, e-newsletters we're sending out. We're upping our socials, our blog posts. We're exploring new terrain, podcasts and video. And all of that has required just more engagements from staff, which I will say has been challenging because I'm asking staff to really think into things. In that first month or so, I think we were all really struggling with some brain fog. And the fifth place where we felt impact is on the kind of shifting narrative of the environmental movement. And I'll talk more about that as we get into the discussion.
Geoff, you're muted.
And there's our first technical glitch of the day. I was saying thank you so much, Sigrid, for covering a lot of ground in a very short time, and we will certainly circle back to a lot of that momentarily here. So now, Maricela, please share with us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. It's so important during these times, right, to come together and to connect, not just in a headspace, but also in community, in heart and in spirit. So happy to be with you all today. One of the things that for me in terms of my work, but also who I am, is the most important thing that I think about my bio that I had nothing to do with, and that is that I'm a proud daughter of Mexican immigrants. And that absolutely drives me, and it really drives our organization as a whole. As an organization that is rooted, driven, and led by people of color, we've been going through crises for a long time. But I'd say that, you know, in terms of socially, you know, systemically, really hard hit starting November 2016. We were all devastated by that. There's been ramifications of that presidential elections every day. We've all felt it in one way or another. So November 2016, December 2017, the Thomas Fire, November again, 2018, more fires, November again, 2019, more fires out here in Ventura County. So it really has been crisis after crisis for the last 4 or 5 years. This is a different crisis, as we've all noted and said, absolutely unprecedented. I want to bring up a framework that I only recently learned about. It's called the Kin Ofin Framework. It's a Welsh word that means habitat, but it's about decision-making domains. And within that, it lays out that we're in this place of disorder and chaos. And the challenge is really to get to this new place of complexity, where we normally function in a place of obvious, what's called literally obvious decision-making domain, and complicated. That's the norm. And now we're in this place of disorder and chaos. And the place that we need to move to, or have had to figure out, is this place of complexity. For us, the two big points where we've had to just continue to adjust is very much at the human level. So our staff, to what Sigrid said, and that we're all feeling this. And so what is the role of employers? What is the role of a place of work to address mental health? We're not mental health professionals. Work isn't the place that you come to get taken care of in terms of your mental health. And yet, this disorder place, this place of chaos, given that we are humans and we are people, is at such a level where it's hard to contain it. It's hard to leave it at home, especially when you're working at home. And so to lift up that mental health aspect and the challenge that it presents to us as organizational leaders, to try to find that balance between knowing that you have to step up in that space, and also knowing that it's not our role to care for it or address it completely. And so that's completely new territory. In our case, many of our staff are immigrants themselves. They're DACA, as in they're undocumented, but they're, you know, quote unquote, allowed to work through DACA. Or we are sons and daughters of immigrants. And so we have folks on staff whose, you know, parents have been unemployed and have no access to any economic security. So it's hitting our staff very, very hard. And then our work for our frontline staff is to be in contact with folks who are most disenfranchised and most on the edge. And so they're having to manage and hear the stories, and from a place of often helplessness, right? We can't change this pandemic. We can't stop it. We can't offer them a job. So that human piece in terms of our staff and in terms of the people that we are trying to be a support to and continue to serve through our work. So in terms of that piece, it's created just for us an even more a sense of urgency in terms of the advocacy work that we do. So yeah, that's a little bit about how we've been impacted and are trying to manage in these times.
Thank you so much, Marisela. Jenna, tell us a bit about your experience in Planned Parenthood's work.
Sure. Well, I am actually struck by how similar our experiences are, and sort of how we all started our remarks is that we, as organizations working with immigrants, working environmental justice issues, reproductive rights, we sort of have grown accustomed a bit to crises, right, and managing through crises. And I think all of our organizations have teams that in a lot of ways are, probably sort of uniquely resilient and comfortable managing through that. And I think that's one of the things that I have found myself being sort of oddly grateful for. It's weird to feel like that's an advantage, but I think it is. And, we certainly had no sort of roadmap or pandemic plan for this moment, but we do, as an organization at Planned Parenthood, have some significant experience with contingency planning and managing through a tremendous amount of uncertainty. We too, went back to thinking about November 2016, Marisela, and some of the work that we did in that moment, looking at, some of our worst case scenario financial modeling and contingency plans. And, of course, that was because right after that election, it appeared that Congress and the new administration would gut the Affordable Care Act and defund Planned Parenthood and leave our patients without a healthcare provider. And so, we actually developed our strategic plan right after that moment. And the very first priority of that plan is really simple and straightforward. It's literally our doors stay open. Our first element, first pillar of our strategic plan is just that, our 5 health centers along the Central Coast remain open and remain providing all of our critical healthcare services to our patients. And the truth is that mantra and that plan works really well for us right now. I think like everybody on the call at Planned Parenthood, we are experiencing financial uncertainty, managing fear and anxiety from staff balancing childcare and work, staff whose households have been impacted by folks losing work, staff who have lost friends and relatives to COVID. And it's extremely stressful, right? And I think there's just no way to make that better for anyone. So we too have found ourselves really needing to anchor ourselves in core organizational values and principles to assure that we are grounded in this moment. Our organizational ethos internally at Planned Parenthood is in this together. We're in this together. And it's actually been interesting to see that sort of become like a global ethos over the past 8 weeks because it really works well right now, right? Like the decisions that any one of us make impacts people that we don't know, impacts elders, right? Potentially life or death consequences of everyday decisions that we all make, and that we really need to be in this together and take it seriously. And that in this together ethos for us manifests in 6 core values. And those are: we tend to the team, we respect and honor all people, we jump in, we try and we learn, we care for our business, and we return to our mission. And so that's obviously not a roadmap, but it has been helpful and stabilizing, and it's provided some direction. You know, from the very beginning of this moment, I think things have changed so much. And the very first days of the crisis, information was coming together so quickly, and it was changing, right? Even our understanding of how the virus was transmitted and how to protect one another changed dramatically in weeks, right? It went from there's no aerosol transmission to there probably is aerosol transmission. In the beginning, we were hearing wearing a mask is not that protective. Now everyone's wearing masks, right? And we understand that that's how we protect others, not necessarily about protecting yourself. And so, you know, communicating that information to staff who remained on the front line was really challenging. And so, you know, like others, we, especially in the beginning, we're doing a lot of all staff calls, webinars. And on the very first one, we found it really helpful to just take a moment to lean into, we return to our mission, and just remind ourselves of the importance of our work and why we're here. During a pandemic, people still need us, right? Our patients still need us. Our communities still need all of us to continue doing this important work. For many people, the care available at Planned Parenthood is not available in other places. A lot of the services we provide cannot be provided via telemedicine. They have to be provided in person. And so we communicated to our staff early on that that meant our doors were going to stay open. And we also recognized we're going to need to make a lot of changes to make that happen, right? And we needed to make those changes with the top priority of keeping staff and patients safe, and balancing that with a very real need to maintain access at Planned Parenthood. So we did a lot of things early on, you know, promoting physical distancing in waiting rooms, robust health screenings, talking to people before they come in, at the time they make an appointment, asking, you know, where they've traveled, have they been in contact with anyone, do they themselves have any symptoms, have they taken their temperature, and really screening to make sure that patients are appropriate for care, you know, without providing too much risk, right, to other folks. We do the same for staff. Staff are screened before they come into work, and staff that have a temperature or have any other symptoms or risk of exposure are instructed to consult with our medical director before they come in. We also implemented a strict mask policy pretty early on. All of our health center staff have been wearing masks for weeks. We've extended that now to all patients have to wear a face covering. If staff do come into the administrative office, most of them are at home. They have to wear a face covering if they're in a setting where others are, a break room, bathroom. And then we leaned into, we tend to the team, right? Which is challenging, right, Marisela? We're not mental health professionals, and we know people are dealing with really big issues. You know, one of the very first conversations we had on our COVID-19 task force was just about recognizing that our frontline staff are heroes, right? And that they need to be recognized, and that they need to be thanked, and that that's not enough, right? Recognizing and thanking people is not enough. And we wanted to make sure that staff felt compensated for the work that they were doing on the front lines. And so we implemented something called mission pay, which was a pretty significant pay differential, you know, just to really make sure that staff understood how much they were valued for the work they were doing. And, you know, we try and we learn, right? Telehealth has been fascinating. It's really been fascinating to watch 10 years, right, of trying to move telehealth along and coming into barrier after barrier and all these challenges, only to have the federal government and the state of California say there are no restrictions, right? There are almost no rules. You can just do that now. And so, you know, pretty much overnight, we were unleashed into telehealth, and you know, with many fewer restrictions and much more care we can deliver online, and that's been great. We've also, I know I have some of our development staff in the webinar right now, and we've done some great, you know, virtual donor meetings. Some of those are a little clunky, right? You get feedback from your donors afterwards about your lighting wasn't good. And that is actually really helpful, right? Like, oh, I didn't realize my lighting wasn't good, thanks. You know, we've moved a lot of our education programs online, and I know we have some of our education staff on too, and that's been, you know, challenging. And, you know, the engaging with teens right now in this moment online it's hard, right? Even schools are really struggling to keep students engaged. And so, you know, we're really trying to figure out how do we continue to make sure teens in our community have access to the information and resources that'll keep them safe in this moment. You know, and then I think one other thing that we had to really try and learn was to be open about and accept our own vulnerability. I'm going to tell a story with permission, and I know that the person that is the subject of the story is also on the line, and some of our staff will recognize it. So one of the earlier all staff calls, you know, we have an amazing, talented leader in our organization who does a lot of work with our staff around building resilience and, you know, increasing employee engagement. And she was presenting some slides on an all-staff webinar, which was really about helping develop skills so that we can all cope through this personally, right? And she got to this one slide, and she was comparing how, you know, how much her life had changed overnight, right? And things that she missed and people that she missed, and how she can't see those people right now. And she got really emotional, and she didn't mean to, right? It was just a normal human reaction, and she got really emotional, and it, you know, it was a little bit hard for her to recover at first. And afterwards, you know, she was embarrassed and she apologized, and we were having some daily clinical services calls every day. And the next day, you know, she again was like, I'm so sorry, I'm so embarrassed. And everybody on the call said, oh my gosh, that was such a relief. Like, if you are struggling with this, right, and you have all these years of experience and you're such an expert in this area, that told me that I'm okay, right? Like, what I'm going through is okay, that we're all struggling with this. And it was really meant a lot to people, right, to see that vulnerability. And so, you know, I think that's just another part of trying and learning. You know, another piece of, you know, in this together and our values is that we respect and honor all people. And, you know, look, we all know on this call that there's already pervasive inequality in our communities, and that COVID-19 is having a very disproportionate impact on people of color and marginalized folks. And so we have to address in our planning the equity piece of this. Right, we have to recognize out loud that people of color, that marginalized folks, that people who already struggle to access healthcare are disproportionately impacted. We heard make equity a standing agenda item at our task force meeting. And what that really means too is, as we make decisions, we say who is burdened by this decision and who benefits. Right, it's really simple, just to sort of layer on that question, right? And so going back to mission pay, and I saw in the chat there was a question, so it's actually a good moment to elaborate. You know, a lot of organizations were implementing some sort of like hazard pay early on, and typically what that looks like is it's some function of your hourly rate, right? Like time and 25%, time and a half. And we realized early on, right, if we did that, the licensed staff in our health centers who already make the most money would make a lot more money, and that frontline workers who don't make quite as much money but have incredibly valuable skills and who are taking the same risk as everyone else in the health center would make less. And so we decided to just do an across-the-board differential. And so the way that that works is staff who work in the health center, patient-facing, for 6 hours a day or less, like a half day, get an additional $25 on their paycheck. If they work 8 hours the full day or over 6 hours, basically, it's $50 for the day. And so it's a significant amount of money, right? And it has had an impact that has disproportionately benefited our frontline staff. And that really was the goal, right? Was to make sure that we did that equitably. Another value of ours is we jump in, and it was, really interesting right out the gate to see that some of our staff had a lot more work to do, right? A lot of preparation, securing PPE, making plans, communicating with staff. We're a regional affiliate, right? We had to get supplies to different places. We have lots of different languages that are spoken. Patient materials were changing. People were burdened by that. And then there were other staff whose events were canceled, who were working hard still, but differently, and maybe with a little bit less urgency, and wanted to help, right? And so we had staff, major gifts officers, development staff standing outside at our health centers and doing health screenings for patients. We had, staff taking days to just drive supplies up and down the coast to make sure that all of our health center staff had what they needed. And I know there are some staff on the call today, Zoe, Gloria, who did that, who stood outside of our health centers. And, I think it really sent a strong message internally too for our health center staff to see that, wow, we really are all in this together, right? Like we are all invested in making sure that we make this mission real, even in this moment. Another one of our values is we care for our business. And we were also really fortunate to go into this crisis strong financially, but we are feeling the strain of the crisis. We're a healthcare organization, our patient visits are down, students are not in the area, people are postponing less urgent care, and that hurts financially. And, we're also watching the California budget crisis, and, knowing that we're going to be impacted, in some way or another by a reduction in rates, most likely. We're fighting really hard to prevent that. But, we have been able to reassure our staff that we are in a position not to have to do any type of reduction before the end of the fiscal year. But the fiscal year ends on June 30th, right? And I know that our staff are really anxious about what happens beyond that. And, we as leadership have a lot of anxiety about that too, because the unknowns are huge, right? They're double-digit percentage numbers. They're massive. And that's hard. And there's not a whole lot you can say to people, right? You can't say it's fine because we don't know all the answers. And we're doing everything that we can to keep our team whole and to keep our organization strong. And so, we just have decided to sort of just acknowledge the reality of that and just be really transparent and say, this is the data that we're using. These are the levers that are going to help us make this decision. We are making these decisions with your best interests in the organizational mission in mind. And we're going to share the same data with you that we're sharing with our finance committee and our board that's going to make these decisions. And that has kind of been a relief, to be honest. It's just been, we are doing the best that we can, and this is how we're making those decisions. And then finally, going back to how we return to our mission, look, all of us on this call are going to be needed more than ever when this is over, and it will be over. And we know, Geoff, you said depression era unemployment, right? Looking around at how folks are impacted in our community, 18% projected unemployment. In every past recession, we have seen record patient numbers, right? People lose their employee-sponsored health insurance, employer-sponsored health insurance. They need us. And we all have the responsibility to make sure that we're ready when that moment comes, because this pandemic is only exacerbating inequalities. It's only creating more need. And the organizations that are represented on this call are uniquely positioned to lift our community back up in that moment. So, I think in that way, as a sector, we really need to stick together and really be in it together to help lift the community back up when that happens.
Thank you so much.
Geoff, you're on mute again. Yeah, okay, thanks.
So there's a lot here, and I know we could spend a day together. So I'm going to try to move us through a few issues, and you all brought up some really critical points that I know everyone would have a comment on. So I want to take something, a thread from Jenna's comments just now, and toss this back to you, Sigrid and Maricela. And that was about the strategies, the practices that may have been long on your list of to-dos or things you'd like to try or move forward, and suddenly there is an opportunity, if we want to call it that, to do that. An open door, if you will, and maybe even a necessity to pivot on some of this work. So the examples I'm thinking of, Jenna was talking about telehealth, which was a struggle for many to get approval from authorities, and now suddenly it is the way. There's a few things around compensation and other things that people have been experimenting with. So Sigrid, could you comment on maybe something or some things that you had on your list that you'd love to try, and now suddenly you realize this is the time as the leader of this organization to try it?
Yeah, sure. There's so many things that I want to respond to from Maricela and Jenna, and things I want to dig into here. But just on a very practical level, one of the things that we have wanted to experiment with, that we've known for a while, as I said, that we're a very events-driven organization, and that has its challenges to it. So we have known that we've been wanting to experiment with other ways, new communication tools that don't rely just on in-person gatherings. So this is, as I said to the team in that first month, this is a time, an opportunity to kind of flex a new muscle that hasn't had a lot of flexing. I mentioned earlier that the very first place where we got a chance to experiment was with Earth Day, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And we knew immediately that, that with our own anniversary, we were going to just move that into next year and kind of take a do-over, next year. But that Earth Day was going to get global coverage, and that we just couldn't go dark on that. So I pulled that team together. There are about 20 core folks, and said, if there's an organization that I think could think creatively about how to be together in a different way, it would be this organization. And I gave them a couple of examples. One I actually have a photo of. Maybe Geoff, if you have that someplace? But it was during the Paris climate talks. Yeah. During the Paris climate talks of 2015, there was a terrorist attack, some might remember, on a nightclub just prior to the talks, which meant that all the marches were canceled. And the really most powerful image that came out for me of that time was this virtual march, where there were, about over 10,000 pairs of shoes that were there to kind of represent those of us, those who couldn't be there. And obviously we can't do something like that here in the pandemic, but I really was feeling that there's this kind of, there's a thread there about in our absence, how present we are in our absence, right? The other example that I shared with that team when we were thinking about how to address Earth Day was more personal. It had to do with my own wedding, which was just a week and a half after 9/11. And many people had not had a chance to gather at that point. And my husband and I really needed to make space for multiple emotions. And so that feels like kind of rich content for how we are approaching and experimenting with being together virtually or not, in which it's mostly not, mostly virtually. And to do that, we started by identifying some key words that would be used to describe both the organization and the event the values and the tone of the event. And the upshot of that is we ended up with a really strong event that was a live action. It was a live action event. We had speakers that we would not normally been able to attract, like the Secretary of California EPA, Jared Blumenfeld, the founder of Earth Day, and so forth. And it left us with a lot of content. And in fact, actually, we had more views of that content than it surpassed the attendance that we would normally have for a live event. So I mentioned all of that just as a deep dive into the experimenting with the new kind of communication tools and new opportunities. So that was one thing that came up for me. There's so much more just content wise in terms of Jenna and Maricella's points.
All right, we're gonna have time. We're gonna get there. So, Maricela, would you maybe comment on things that you have tried or that you have been given the opportunity to try that have long been on your mind, whether they be strategies or types of work? I know doing community organizing work and policy work as you do every day, there's pieces of that are probably more easily shifted to technology, and some that really aren't. And door knocking, for example. So, anything you want to share on that? And you are muted, by the way, so thank you for following my example.
You're always one to follow, Geoff. Really thinking about what we were forced into. One is the working from home. That was not something that I ever gave thought to in terms of being, in essence, a standard for staff, as opposed to, a half day here or a half day there, but the norm. And I bring that up because this period of COVID is expected to, the disorder, the chaos, the uncertainty is expected to continue for 18 months. And so as executive directors, as leaders of our organizations, at whatever time we call it post-COVID, I think that that's something we're going to have to figure out how best to do that for the long run. How much of a norm is working from home? And then what does that mean in terms of letting go of office space, or, investing more into people's quote unquote home office? So that was a real learning for me, because when I think about, what we consider, in our box, right? Of like, no, I'm not even going to consider that. So before COVID, the idea of how about if all staff work from home was a non-starter. It wasn't even a concept. And all of a sudden, literally from one day to the next, it's the reality. And it's the only way to do things. Yeah, figuring out how to make that work, and then what's going to be the policy, post-COVID. But the other one is in terms of the organizing. In terms of how, when we're, for those of us that, interact face-to-face with our constituents, it has relied a great deal more on technology. With our immigrant adult leaders, we're using WhatsApp for chat groups, and even with our youth, Zoom meetings with our youth. That presents its challenges too, in terms of how do you really build connection and engage people who haven't been engaged through video, through just phone. So that's an ongoing challenge. A wonderful opening for innovation. If there was one policy pre-COVID that was on our wish list, but did not seem achievable in the near future, is now possible, and that's to make systemic reform around allowing undocumented workers into the unemployment system. So the unemployment insurance excludes, kicks out, the word I've been using is deport. We can't deport all immigrants, some might wish, but we do it in other ways. They're excluded and exiled from unemployment insurance, even though they are workers and they're known to be workers. So that's actually a policy opportunity that was on that wish list, and that COVID has actually created a possibility, an opening to making that systemic reform at the state level.
Absolutely. And so on that note, that's one of probably three main areas that I hear frequently of what's going to stick when it comes to the policy conversation? What's going to shift our policy conversation? Certainly around immigration and undocumented workers and their role in our communities and economy. Certainly around access to Wi-Fi and universal Wi-Fi, which of course our country is far behind much of the developed world in. And the other is healthcare policy and access to healthcare. So to the extent that it's attached to your employment and suddenly you have an unprecedented drop in employment, what does that mean for healthcare? And of course, Jenna, you mentioned that. So in all of this, the tie here is all the advocacy piece, and you all do advocacy work. It's part of each of your missions in different ways. How are you viewing the role of advocacy in your work differently now than maybe you viewed it in February? Maybe Jenna, we can start with you. I mean, you've all referenced that from 2016 forward, all of the different policy battles that we've all been in. What's different suddenly, or how are you approaching that in your work?
Yeah, one of the harder things for us to navigate was what to do with programs that required door-to-door outreach and, really high-touch outreach in our communities. We were just positioned to start some big canvassing projects around the census at the start of the crisis. And, so I think that was really challenging. This month, we should be having our Capital Day in Sacramento. And so it's different. And so, when it comes to like census work, our team was really creative and created some videos of like being door to door, even though, there was just a video of being door to door, and then was sort of aggressive on social media about, pushing that content out and making sure that people still knew that they needed, to complete the census and why it was important. We also have Promotorix in Santa Maria, who, that was really challenging because the nature of that work is they're in a group going door to door. It was not, it did not feel defensively safe for them to continue to do that work in that way. And so, so that team has been working on, also trying to do some, Zoom, replicate that work. I think one of the bigger opportunities and threats of this moment is around the election and, the real necessity of having accessible voting, whether it's vote by mail. California did the right thing, and extending vote by mail to all citizens, and some other states are trying to do that. But of course, there's really significant pushback to that, and we all know why, right? It's because, certain politicians and, certain policies rely on voter suppression, to be passed because they're not popular. And so I think we all need to be really loud about that and vocal, because I think that one of my fears right now is that since we don't know how to do this work well, and there are such high stakes policies, and there's an election that really requires robust participation, I think we really have to not forget about that, right? And make sure that we really can continue to have meaningful engagement with people when we can't talk to them face to face, when we otherwise would knock on their door.
Right, absolutely. Sigrid, what about you in the policy arena? What's different in this moment?
Yeah, I think there's some, well, the first thing I want to say is that, to Jenna's point, coming back to mission, and that was very grounding for us, because really the climate crisis is not on hiatus, right? So how do we advance climate related policies in this time? There are some things that are kind of, there's some opportunities, and then I have some real concerns. And the concern on a policy level is this year, both the local cities and the county were all gearing up to revise their climate action plans. And it was part of our work plan to really dig into that with them. And now all of that planning process is slowed down or on pause. While we are seeing some reduction in emissions because people are staying home and not engaging in airline flight and car travel, and that's really just not the way in which you want to kind of solve the climate crisis, right? it really requires policy change. So those are the items that are kind of on my mind. I think that some of the shifts that are happening, or at least the discussions that are happening that are a lot more kind of front and center, just a lot more present, include you know, conversations about the fragility of a globalized food system. That feels like something that we really haven't been talking about outside of kind of inner circles, and now that feels a lot more present. And then the conversation that has been touched on here, just how social and economic inequities are really exacerbating or exacerbated by almost any crisis. And so I definitely have some concern about the kind of cascading effects of a public health crisis, economic crisis, and then environmental and climate crises all compounding each other at this point. So it's a balance of some opportunities and concerns. Some of them will have policy implications. I think we're really on that knife edge right now, where something could incubate out of this and take us forward into real, true systems change. Or we could just kind of revert to, we want to get back to normal. We kind of pick up the ideas that are laying around, as Naomi Klein would say, and we end up deepening the systemic inequities that because we don't have a path forward.
So that note is exactly where I want to go next. And I want to give Maricela, if you have more to say. I mean, the advocacy policy work is so core to your work in your organization. Please do add anything you feel you'd like to. There's a next question attached to that I want to go to, but let me give you the floor first, then we'll talk a bit more about this inequality question.
Okay. Yeah, I want to take the opportunity to raise up the issue of housing. That, you know, one of the prep questions was, what's one of your growing concerns? There is a tsunami building in terms of mass displacement and homelessness. When you have people who are not getting their unemployment, unemployment is just a portion anyway, even if you are getting it. When the rent comes due, you have nothing to pay it with. So we started with a moratorium on evictions, but eventually that moratorium will end. So just want to lift that up, because all of us as nonprofits will have then, will be hit by some response that we have to attend to.
So on all of these notes, actually, there's this question, you've all brought it up, and of course, for some of it, if you're doing work in a field where inequality is the landscape in which you do your work, it's hard to conceive of someone not recognizing the mass inequalities within our communities, within the country. And yet, if there's a gift in any of this, it's that suddenly, at least the conversations I've had with folks that never previously would have even acknowledged, much less engaged in a conversation around inequality, for whatever reason, they are seeing it now. And it's front and center. It may be new in their experience, but it's being recognized. How do we navigate that new reality? You know, a lot of people, I think Jenna made in her opening remarks, we're all in the same boat, it can be a very empowering sort of bringing together to say we're all in the same boat, and yet you see the opposite, and we've all seen the counter to that is, no, we're not. We're on the same storm, but we are definitely not in the same boat as far as tools we have to respond. So how does this new, and again, not new for you, but new focus and spotlight on inequalities, whether they be economic, racial, class-based, gender-based, access-based, geography-based, how is that affecting how you think about your own strategies and work, given that each of you already do work on the question of inequality? Does that have a impact on strategy for you? Maybe Jenna, you could comment on this, since you made reference to that term.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Yeah, I mean, look, I think health equity has been, you know, a major challenge in public health, and it, you know, racism and inequity is deeply embedded in the healthcare system, right? I mean, we know that you know, Black women and maternal mortality is a massive crisis that doesn't get anywhere near the type of attention that it deserves. And, you know, that's just sort of one example, right? And I think that in this pandemic, we have seen, you know, particularly when it comes to reproductive rights, and gender inequality be just exacerbated because it's just another excuse, right, for politicians to deprioritize the rights and health of the people that they don't prioritize, right? And we've seen that across the board. It's apparent. One of the first things that we experienced when there was a huge crisis around personal protective equipment, right? This country wasn't nearly prepared to have every healthcare worker in the country wear a mask. We didn't have enough masks, and everybody was scrambling. One of the first things that happened was that the states that are already the most hostile to reproductive rights sent cease and desist notices to Planned Parenthood and other providers of abortion care and told them that abortion was not an essential service, for example, which meant, you know, that this time-sensitive service could not be provided to people who needed it, which disproportionately, you know, are younger women and many times women of color. And so places like Texas, Oklahoma, you know, were embroiled immediately in political fights. You know, I think that's the type of exploitation of a crisis that we see. We also see, you know, you can't deny that, number one, you know, aside from, you know, some of the biggest states like New York and Michigan with case numbers, there's a huge crisis of COVID-19 in the Navajo community. Nobody talks about that, right? I mean, some of the largest case numbers are among the most underserved and marginalized communities in our country. And I think you also just can't separate this sort of rush to reopen and go back to normal from, you know, just how casual our society can be about deciding whose lives, you know, are important and who we really are all in this together for. So I think that it's important with anything when it comes to, you know, inequity to be really outspoken about it, right? And it's just about acknowledging the reality. Don't skirt around it. We have to say it out loud. We're all seeing it, right? We all see what happened in Lompoc, for example. That's part of our community, right? And it's not okay, right? And I think that we all have a responsibility to make sure that this crisis, in this crisis, we don't skirt over that reality and we don't ignore what we're seeing, because otherwise, you know, it won't improve.
Thanks, Jenna. Well, Sigrid, what about you? How does the new focus or maybe new awakening for some on all of the inequalities affect your work and your strategies?
Yeah, I think that the environmental movement has really suffered from the not recognizing these concerns for a long time, or recognizing them but not knowing how to address them. So there's been deep injustices and inequities in the environmental movement, basically since its beginning 50 years ago. I would say there are some things that I've seen that have started to shift that, or at least shift the conversation. One has been the youth engagement, right? In the last few years, bringing more youth into the environmental and climate movement. And they're coming in with different lenses and really righteous anger and demanding greater partnerships and engagement and addressing deep issues. You know, I'm seeing it in, I've been particularly concerned lately, and this is one thread of concern, but particular concern lately, just in terms of those cascading and compounding effects that I spoke about earlier, as we see a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and then a climate crisis all kind of layering onto each other, and that even some of the strategies we would use to address one or another, I mean, it's just become so evident. It becomes so, the inequities become so evident, as, you know, even just the strategy of social distancing really is a privilege, right? And that reminds me of a conversation I had with Thomas Teig from Direct Relief not too long ago, in which he talked about, you know, evacuation being a privilege, evacuation being a climate resilience strategy being a privilege. So I think I'm seeing a lot more just awareness at levels from boardrooms to news reports to the streets, really just about the conversation. And I think that that's going to have a profound effect on or could have a profound effect on a kind of more nitty-gritty or personal level. Maricela and I have been working for the last, I don't remember when we started this, Maricela, I think maybe 4 years ago, 3 years ago, Gary might remember, a climate justice network, which is for the Central Coast, which is designed to bring together the social justice organizations and more traditional environmental organizations, addressing, getting to know each other for one thing, understanding each other's work, and then working together to learn and address institutional racism and issues that I think you know, are very much needed to be brought into the environmental movement. So those are a couple of places where I'm starting to see all those ties thread together.
We're going to come back to that in just a moment because there's some questions around that partnership and the need for it right now. But Maricela, as someone who works constantly to try to highlight the inequalities, get people to see them and then react and solve, does the current focus, is this help? Is it just overwhelm? How are you seeing it in your work?
Yeah, certainly we'll take any attention to it at any point. But I do think that what we need to be aware of is that, you know, it not be this sort of this, you know, very small window of time, right, where it surfaces and, you know, it's on people's minds for a brief time, and then it, you know, peters out after a while. So I came up with 3 Ps, since PPP is being used a lot these days for different acronyms. So people to people, in that if you are interested, concerned, want to delve deeper into any aspect of inequality, at the heart, at the start, it's about people to people connections. That part of inequality is keeping others as foreign or as distant, you know, and that includes when they're only, they're in some ways relegated to this position of, you know, only as client, only as constituent, only, you know, where their role is sort of like, you know, to just receive, you know, from the organization, and there's a real power dynamic there. So people to people, in terms of inequality, calls us really at our deep spiritual and heart level to engage with people as equals. And so what does that mean in our organizations? If we're a client serving, you know, nonprofit, you know, what are ways where, you know, we are engaging with our clients in another way, where it's not this dynamic of I'm giving to you, for as important as the service is, you know, as there are, you know, advisory groups, you know, is there just other mechanisms where it's about people to people connections, not, you know, our role in service to others necessarily, but like connecting. So that's one. The other is pipeline for nonprofits throughout the state. We have to take seriously, beyond theory, beyond, you know, a webinar, a training, diversity, equity, and inclusion in our staff. It's not okay if all our frontline staff, or, you know, the majority of our people of color in our organizations are only relegated again to one section of our organization, or not at all. We are in a Latino community. 45% of our region is Latino. That's almost 1 in 2. Take a look at your staff. Does that reflect that reality of our own lived experience? So the pipeline, inequality brings up issues of hiring, of retention, of pay, of promotion, all along the pipeline of our staff and our organizations, including our boards. And then the last is philanthropy. Apparently, from one statistic, less than 1% of philanthropic dollars go to Latino-led organizations. Less than 0.5% for organizations that focus on immigrant and refugees of all philanthropy. In California, 1 in 4 is immigrant. So PPP, people to people, are organizational pipelines and a call to philanthropy for equity in their giving.
Did you just come up with the PPP right there? Is that one you've used before? It just came up with, all right. Brilliant. That's brilliant. So on that front, so you have all referenced something within the last few minutes, and we have a question, and I want to weave this all together. So it's the people to people, it's the issue areas, it's that intersection of issues, the intersectionality of all of our issues, really. But you mentioned the Climate Justice Network most recently. How does an organization who may not have, and how do leaders of organizations who may not have already established partnerships and good working relationships with folks, and now recognize the value of that in this moment where we're all socially distanced and where our communication is all mediated, and in the ways that we would normally build trust by getting to know each other, it's different, and it may be harder. It may be, for some, it may be easier, but generally speaking, it's different than what we're used to. How do we go about that now? So if you suddenly come to the realization that, hey, I need to work with so-and-so, and I've heard their name, or I've seen them, but we've never gotten to know each other, and yet suddenly this moment calls for us to be partners. How do you build that in this moment? I see some smiles and some nods, so I'm not sure who to pick on first. I'll take volunteers.
I'll go first. Happy to dive in. Along those lines of people to people, I think though that it actually ties in really well in terms of this moment, this period, this phase of disorder and chaos. Social distancing is that I think we're all feeling the need to connect more deeply, to connect to more people, given that we're working out of a room inside a house, and and in organizing, at the core of it, it's what we call the one-on-one, the personal visit. It is reaching out to that person who you've never talked to, and initiating a conversation with no other agenda except, let's connect and let's share, your interests, your needs, my interests, my needs. So it's not necessary to already have an agenda of like, I have that project, or, I want to offer you this, or I need this from you. But just people to people. I think that it responds to this need of wanting more connection, but then it's very practical in terms of needing to create new connections.
Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree on the value of partnerships. So I don't need to sell that, because I think that's very clear. Right now, I have a board member who's a former fire chief of the city of Santa Barbara, and he talks about how you don't want to meet your partners, in the middle of the disaster on the battlefield, but this is a different type of situation. And one that, as Maricela spoke to, that we all, I think, have this deep need for greater connection. But what I was struggling with your question, Geoff, is really just the logistical part of it. Because I know, so on the one hand, we're craving and needing deeper connection. And yes, I would agree with Maricela, just in terms of, just get started in terms of partnership building. And then on just a more very practical logistical side, most of us are probably still navigating and maybe just coming out of a free fall, right? So where we actually have the ability to lift our head up and look a little bit further down the horizon. So it's making time for that. And then I know I'm experiencing myself, and I'm hearing from a lot of people just in terms of Zoom fatigue, and it is really hard to have, kind of do relationship development over Zoom. So, I would be inclined to be looking for just ways to safely engage with people that isn't another Zoom call.
Certainly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I have just a little bit to add to that. I mean, the truth is, I think the answer is not. We haven't really done that right yet. I don't feel that we have, you know, really forged any new relationships. We have deepened some, though, right? I think, you know, in navigating this, particularly in the healthcare space, I think we, you know, really had the opportunity to, you know, collaborate with some of the hospitals, public health. You know, one of the, also it's kind of a joke, one of the earlier things that we realized was in all the rush to get the test, the COVID test, BCMC called us and told us that the swabs that are used to test for COVID are the same that Planned Parenthood uses to test for herpes, which we didn't know. And they really needed some, and could they have some? And so, you know, we checked our inventory and then kind of got in that habit, right, of working with the healthcare system and well, you know, okay, now we need some gloves and you know, and deepening some of those relationships in the healthcare system. And so that was something good that came out of it. One of the other things, though, that came up was we were in our board nominating cycle, and we actually have a significant amount of turnover planned for this year on our board, and a number of candidates to interview. And, you know, really varying degrees of closeness to the organization, where, you know, some of the folks that we were talking to, we knew really well, they've already served on committees, where other folks are a little bit newer to the organization. And we really needed to spend some more time with them. And so the question came up, like, do we postpone this? How do we, you know, do we try to renew people and postpone the whole thing? And we decided, no, you know, we would move forward and we would just move the interviews to Zoom. And, you know, so I think that's something that we're sort of in the middle of navigating still, because it's going to be interesting, I think, to have, I think, 5 or 6 new board members who some of us haven't met in person, and we're not going to be able to bring them on and orient them in the way that we would, and, you know, we won't be able to break bread with them and, you know, get to know them on a personal level in the same way. So we're spending a lot of time trying to think about that, you know, how to build a cohesive board in a, you know, in a format where we really can't spend time together. So I think that, you know, we're all kind of still on that learning curve. And I suspect, just like, you know, how good we're all getting at Zoom, we will start to figure some of that out.
Geoff, can I add a couple things quickly? First of all, we also started employing the breakout rooms in our board meetings as well, because we're knowing that people are needing that social connectivity. But if I could just widen out just for a second, Geoff, and, you know, to your point about the importance of partnership and networking, that I really do not see our community navigating its way out of this situation without really deep collaboratives. We have some great elected leaders. You know, we've got some leadership gaps in a few places, but we do have some strong leaders. But it's going to take, it really is going to take local government, the social sector, and the business sector working together. And for that, we're going to just have to, we'll have to figure out the logistical aspect of it in order to really deepen that. I sat down with a partner the other day, and we mapped out, was more than 20 networks that we know of that already exist. And so if just even delegates coming out of some of those networks could start talking with each other, I know it's one more thing for us to do, but I just don't see us navigating a massive public health, economic, and environmental crisis simultaneously without really digging in.
Absolutely. You know, it's something I've certainly reflected on, but I've heard it reflected back in many contexts that and Maricela, you mentioned it in your opening remarks, you know, we're sort of veterans now of all of these layered on disasters in recent years. And one of the benefits of that is, I think of Thomas Fire and debris flow in particular, we saw very starkly what wasn't working in our networks, our systems that weren't talking to each other, that weren't well coordinated, that weren't relevant on the ground in the ways that we thought they should be. And there was a rewiring, if you will, of the entire nonprofit sector around that time, and at least in certain sections. And as we walked into this, or rather this smacked us in the face, I guess, those popped up. They had lasted a couple of years, and people were in a different place to pick up the phone and know who to call and such. And I just want to acknowledge that a lot of our sector has done that, and there's obviously more to do. All right, we're getting near the end of our time, and I want to make sure that there's time. I got a couple more questions, and I want to do maybe a lightning round. So I'm going to ask it in a pair, and then I'll ask each of you to go ahead and give me your best thoughts on this. The pair of questions are: one, what's going to stick? I mean, we're 10 weeks into this. As many of us have referenced, this is many months to go. Who knows what goes back to a previous normal, what becomes a new normal. But when we look back 10 years, I think we're all going to refer to this time of innovation and all the things that were created and tried. What's going to stick for you and your organizations going forward? That even if we get back to February 2020 normal, what's going to stay changed? What are the things you've tried or had to try that you believe now, looking back, will work better for you, regardless of what the landscape is? I'll look at you, Sigrid. You've got you're
unmuted.
You're unmuted.
Yeah, I do think the work from home strategies and then providing some support to large companies and others who are also dealing with that issue, and having and working with folks to see that not only as a public health strategy but as a climate strategy. I might see that maintaining for a while. I think we did a giant experiment here, and I think those tools are with us to stay.
Jenna, I know looks like you got kicked off the video link, but you're on the phone there. What's going to stick for you for Planned Parenthood?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had also just sort of started really running into not having enough administrative space. And, I know our staff are really enjoying in a lot of ways, not all of them, but many of them really enjoying, working from home and having some of that flexibility. We're also an organization that has struggled with staff having really long commutes because we are regional. And so I think having some more of that flexibility, I think there's also some opportunity in that as well. Thinking about having maybe a larger talent pool to pull from. If we're not so reliant on staff being in the office, then that means that, we can maybe have some more staff that are telecommuting and don't even necessarily have to live in the area to work for us. So I think that there's some opportunity there. And then I think on the telehealth piece, I think it's going to be really hard to roll back a lot of what has been implemented in the past 8 weeks. I think providers are really embracing telehealth. Patients are certainly appreciating the convenience and access. And so I think that is here to stay.
Great. Thank you. We're going to see you back on video too. Maricela, what's going to stick for a cause for you?
Yes. I'm going to take that very popular answer of, I don't know yet. We are just going to start, we have our mid-year staff retreat next week, and we're including visioning time there. One of the differences between suffering in vain and suffering that becomes labor pains of creating new life is vision. A crisis is a time for us as institutional leaders, as community leaders, to hold vision, to include more people in visioning. We have to get clear for ourselves, our own lives, for our staff, for our organizations, for the people we serve in our communities. What vision does this crisis actually help us to clarify, to have a greater commitment to? Because if we don't have that vision and hold it, and bring ourselves around it and connect to people with it, the default is a future that's actually worse than what we've come from. So as much as this is a time for immediate response and experimentation, this is an important time for visioning.
Thank you. Thank you for that. All right. I know we're at time, but I know people are still hanging on with us. This has been wonderful. So before we go, I want to ask each of you one closing question, give you a chance to say any final words, and we'll turn it over to Gary Clark to close this out. But the question is, you are all leaders of organizations. You've all spoken about your role in taking care of your teams, your coworkers, your communities. How do you take care of yourself so that you can keep doing the work. And any final thoughts that you'd like to share? So it's a twofer. Now that we got you back, Jenna, we're going to start with you. Oh, but you're still on mute.
Oh, it says I'm unmuted now.
There we go.
I was
Yes.
okay. What was the question? Was it about self-care? How do we?
Yeah, so how, I mean, you all
self-care?
take care of everyone around you. How do you take care of yourself so you can keep working? And then any final thoughts before we close out today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just say two things. The first thing, really quickly, is exercise. Geoff knows I am really into my Peloton. It's been a total lifesaver. I feel like it was another advantage that I walked into this crisis with, was the at-home workout routine that I really like. And then I think the other thing is taking time off. I was really resistant to do that initially because we were all working so hard. And I actually had a moment where I could tell I wasn't making decisions in the clear way that I wanted to. And I realized that, I wasn't setting a good example. And I took a Friday off. I just took a 3-day weekend once, and I felt so much better. And then, I started having conversations with my team too about doing that. Just because we're spending more time at home or just because we're working differently doesn't mean we're practicing self-care. And we have to be really deliberate about doing that. So that, doing that and leading by example.
Thank you so much. Maricela, how about you? How do you take care of, make sure you're revived and can continue, and any final thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I have a 6-year-old at home. He'll be 6 next Wednesday. I have to say he helps me because he's all play, and that's awesome. For folks that don't have kids, joy, like being intentional about connecting to joy and playfulness in some way. And another ritual is, because a lot of our work as leaders is like continues in our head, like even once we shut off the computer or not talking to anybody, a ritual at the end of the day of just saying, I've done what I could today. It'll be here tomorrow. And that helps. It helps to shut off the mind.
Thank you. Sigrid.
Beautiful. Well, anything that can get me outdoors. Right now, so hiking, walking, or whatever. But right now, gardening. So, and that gives me a great sense of accomplishment that I like to grow my own food. And then I would say that maintaining some amount of kind of social connectivity or social connection with folks. And I've felt very fortunate that there are a number of people in my life, colleagues, friends, who reach out and really ask how they can support. And even if I don't necessarily take them up on that, just having that offer, because this really can be a pretty lonely job. And as somebody said, I think it was Jenna at the beginning, we didn't get the manual for how to lead in a pandemic. So we are definitely, flying our little spacecraft sometimes, just trying to navigate new territory. And then in the end, those types of connections really, again, as back to my original theme, that's what not only builds personal resilience, but community resilience. And so those are my kind of go-to strategies.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say I am so grateful to each of you for your work, your friendship, your colleagueship. The organizations, of course, are all critical to our community. This has been a lot of fun, actually. And to hear each of you share your wisdom and your reflections has been wonderful. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank Maricela Morales, Executive Director of CAUSE. I want to thank Jenna Tosh, President and CEO of our Central Coast Planned Parenthood, and Sigrid Wright, the CEO of Community Environmental Council. And I know there's more to talk about. Maybe we'll find ourselves back here sometime soon. But thank you, and thank you. And I'll now turn it over to Gary Clark.
Yeah, so I'm Gary Clark. I'm Director of the Collaboration for Social Impact at the Santa Barbara Foundation. And I have to say that's the best 90 minutes that I've spent on Zoom since I started my relationship with Zoom. So thank you so much. And I want to echo one of the comments by one of our attendees, Meryl Brown, who really appreciates the transparency that the panelists have shared. So thank you so much, Jenna, Maricela, Sigrid. Our community is really blessed to have your leadership in our community. So thank you so much. And thanks to our expert moderator, Geoff Green. And thanks to our sponsors, Montecito Bank and Trust and Ventura Community Foundation. And then a special appreciation goes out to the co-conveners from the Capacity Building Collaborative, and that's CLU, Center for Nonprofit Leadership, Nonprofit Resource Network, Santa Barbara Foundation, the Fund for Santa Barbara, Leading from Within, Association for Fundraising Professionals, Just Communities, and Visionality. I just do want to share that there are a few upcoming webinars. This afternoon, the Fund for Santa Barbara is hosting Community Organizing in a Pandemic and Beyond with Hazel Davalos and Lucas Zucker of Cause. And then Light Gabler HR law firm is hosting The Good, the Bad, and the Pandemic. Where are we now and where do we go from here? And that's on May 27th. And then on June 3rd, we have board recruiting in 2020 with Envision Consulting. And on June 11th, we have the State of Philanthropy and Capital Campaigns with Becca Merrill and Steve Wilmont of Netzel Grigsby and Associates. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. And we hope to see you on one of the upcoming webinars.
You all.
Thank you.
Thank you.